In the silence of defeat, long before the world knew his name, a boy was born in Braunau am Inn, Austria. Adolf Hitler entered a household divided between cruelty and tenderness. His father, Alois, was stern, controlling, and often violent. To him, discipline was delivered with fists and fury. His mother, Clara, was gentle, nurturing, and endlessly protective. More than once, she placed herself between father and son, shielding the boy with her own body. From this fractured home, young Adolf learned two lessons: that power was rooted in brutality, and that love could vanish without warning. From an early age, he dreamed of escape. He wanted to be an artist, to sketch landscapes, and paint the world in colors of his choosing. Twice he applied to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, and twice he was rejected. To him, these failures were not just refusals, they were humiliations, proof that society did not see his worth. Then, in 1907, came the wound that would never heal. His mother, Clara, the one constant source of affection in his life, died of breast cancer. Adolf was only 18. Her death left him unmoored, drifting into poverty and loneliness. He wandered Vienna as a homeless young man, selling sketches for coins, sleeping in flop houses, and standing in bread lines among the desperate and destitute. Later, he would look back on these years with a bitter pride, saying that it was then he grew hard, capable of enduring anything.
Und für dieses Volk und dieses Volk wollen wir ringen und wollen wir kämpfen und niemals erlahmen und niemals ermüden und niemals verzagen und niemals verzagen.
But the truth was darker. In those years of hunger and isolation, resentment fermented. Surrounded by voices that blamed Jews, Marxists, and foreigners for society's ills, he absorbed hatred as if it were nourishment. His personal failures no longer belonged to him alone. They were projected outward, woven into an ideology that turned his bitterness into blame. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Hitler seized it as salvation. He volunteered for the Bavarian army, trading the uncertainty of the streets for the purpose of a uniform. The trenches were brutal. Mud, rats, hunger, and death on every side. Yet here he found belonging. Serving as a messenger, racing through shellfire and bombardments, he displayed a reckless courage. He earned the Iron Cross, both second class and first class, an unusual honor for a corporal. At last, he was someone. Not a failed artist, not a drifter, but a soldier with medals pinned to his chest. Yet even war betrayed him. In 1918, as the conflict dragged to its end, he was blinded by a mustard gas attack. In the hospital, lying in darkness, he received the news. Germany had surrendered. The Kaiser was gone, the empire dissolved, the army defeated. To millions, it was a wound of unimaginable depth. To Hitler, it was unbearable. He embraced the myth that the army had been undefeated on the battlefield, but stabbed in the back by politicians, Jews, and traitors at home. In that belief, humiliation found its voice, and bitterness became destiny. The boy beaten by his father, the young man rejected by art, the soldier blinded in war, all of these selves converged into one. From failure, he drew hatred. From defeat, he drew vengeance. And from the shadows of a broken nation, Adolf Hitler began to imagine a future remade in his image. Germany in 1919 was a nation in pieces. Its empire dismantled, its people humiliated, its streets filled with hunger and unrest. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped away territories, shackled the economy with crushing reparations, and reduced its once proud army to a shadow of its former self. Veterans returned from the front, to find themselves not celebrated as heroes, but discarded as burdens. The air was thick with bitterness. Amid this chaos, Adolf Hitler remained in uniform, unwilling to shed the only identity that had ever given him purpose. He was assigned to political duties by the army, a role meant to monitor radical movements and keep soldiers from falling under dangerous influences. It was a small assignment, one of little importance, but for Hitler, it became the spark of destiny. In September 1919, he attended a meeting of a small, obscure group, the German Workers' Party. It was a gathering of only a few dozen men, restless nationalists, filled with complaints about Germany's betrayal. Hitler was there as an observer, but when he spoke, something extraordinary happened. His words, sharp and heated, gripped the room. His anger mirrored their own. His passion electrified the air. What was meant to be surveillance became transformation. He had found his audience, and they had found their voice. Very quickly, the party ceased to be a group he was assigned to monitor. It became the vessel of his ambition. By 1921, Hitler seized leadership, reshaping it into something far more potent. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, soon known as the Nazi Party. With it came symbols designed to stir emotion: the swastika, the uniforms, the disciplined marches. What began as fringe rhetoric was now fused with spectacle and performance, capturing the imagination of those who longed for strength in a time of weakness. Hitler's speeches became his weapon. In beer halls across Munich, he thundered about betrayal and revenge. He named enemies, Jews, communists, politicians, and promised renewal through unity, purity, and strength. Crowds that had once been hopeless now surged with belief. Ordinary people, crushed by inflation and unemployment, found in his fury the echo of their own despair. He had learned how to turn resentment into fire, and his voice became a force capable of moving thousands. In 1919, he also committed his ideas to paper in what became known as the Gick Letter, his earliest written statement on what he called the Jewish question. In it, he argued that the removal of Jews from German life must become the unshakable goal of government policy. It was not yet the machinery of genocide, but the seed was visible. Hatred was no longer a whisper, it was a written conviction. By 1923, Hitler's ambitions had grown beyond speeches. He looked to Italy, where Benito Mussolini had marched on Rome and seized power with bold defiance. To Hitler, this was a model. If Mussolini could topple a government with force, why not him? On November 8, 1923, he attempted his own coup, the beer hall putsch. Storming into a crowded hall in Munich, pistol in hand, he declared that a national revolution had begun. The crowd froze. His followers tried to rally, but the uprising was poorly planned, chaotic, and quickly crushed. Shots were fired in the streets. 16 Nazis lay dead, and Hitler fled in disgrace. His moment of triumph had collapsed into humiliation. Arrested for high treason, he faced trial before the German nation. But here, failure twisted into opportunity. In the courtroom, Hitler transformed his defense into a stage, delivering speeches that were published in newspapers across the country. What should have been the end of his career became the beginning of his fame. Germany, for the first time, knew his name. Sentenced to 5 years in prison, Hitler found himself behind the walls of Landsberg Fortress. But confinement did not silence him. It focused him. In his cell, he dictated his ideas to loyal followers, crafting the book that would become Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Its pages were disorganized, rambling, filled with prejudice and obsession. Yet within them lay the blueprint of his vision. He promised a reborn Germany, cleansed of Jews, liberated from Versailles, and destined to dominate Europe. Few read it seriously at the time. fewer still believed it could ever become reality. But in those pages, history's darkest future was being sketched. In December 1924, less than a year after his arrest, Hitler was unexpectedly released. Pardoned despite objections, he had served only a fraction of his sentence. He emerged not as a broken conspirator, but as a man with a cause, a following, and a book that would one day become a manifesto of destruction. The failed forgotten soldier, the fiery agitator. Each phase of his life had been fused into one. The firebrand who had once stood in beer halls now carried something more dangerous, a vision sharpened by defeat and a determination fueled by obsession. His rise had only begun. When Adolf Hitler walked out of prison in 1924, the world around him seemed calmer than the one he had left behind. Germany's economy was beginning to stabilize. International loans and new agreements had given the Weimar Republic a brief sense of balance. To many Germans, politics no longer burned with the same fury. The Nazi Party, banned after the failed coup, had scattered into fragments. It would have been easy for the world to forget his name. But Hitler had no intention of fading into obscurity. He reorganized the Nazi Party with new precision. This was no longer a ragged band of angry men shouting in beer halls. It became a movement with uniforms, symbols, and discipline. Propaganda was sharpened into a weapon. Posters, newspapers, and rallies spread the message of nationalism and racial purity. Behind the spectacle was a man who understood that politics was not simply about policies. It was about emotion, identity, and belief.
Even when he was barred from public speaking for 2 years by Bavarian authorities, Hitler's influence did not vanish. Others spoke his words, carried his ideas, and built his image. When the ban was lifted, he returned to the stage more powerful than before. Crowds gathered not just to hear a politician, but to witness a performance. His voice rose and fell like a conductor's baton, his fury climbing to a fevered pitch, his pauses pulling audiences into silence. To those listening, it felt less like politics and more like revelation. For a time, however, the Nazi movement remained on the fringe. The late 1920s brought relative prosperity, and in prosperous times, radical voices struggled to find listeners. But prosperity is fragile, and history would soon provide the perfect storm. In 1929, the global economy collapsed. The Great Depression spread like a plague, devastating industries and wiping out savings. In Germany, the impact was catastrophic. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed. Families starved. Banks closed their doors. Once again, desperation filled the streets, and despair demanded a savior. This was the soil in which Hitler thrived. While other parties bickered and faltered, the Nazis offered a simple, intoxicating message. They promised jobs, order, and national revival. They promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles and restore Germany's pride. They named scapegoats for the suffering, Jews, communists, and traitors, and the suffering people listened. Election by election, the Nazi Party grew. From obscurity, it rose to become the largest party in the Reichstag. In a nation where democracy was fragile and unstable, Hitler presented himself as the strong leader who could cut through chaos. He was no longer the failed revolutionary of 1923. He was the man who claimed he alone could save Germany. In January 1933, the moment arrived. Pressured by conservative elites who believed they could control him, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. What was meant to be a compromise became a catastrophe. The illusion of glory was complete. The failed artist, the forgotten soldier, the fiery agitator had climbed to the pinnacle of power. Crowds cheered, flags waved, and the promise of renewal filled the air. But beneath the surface, a darker reality pulsed. The stage was set not for revival, but for tyranny. Hitler stood at the threshold of history, ready to transform despair into dictatorship, and to lead Germany, and the world, into a nightmare that would scar humanity forever. The appointment of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor in January 1933 marked more than a political shift. It marked the beginning of a transformation that would turn democracy into dictatorship and fear into the foundation of a nation. Within weeks, fire consumed the Reichstag building, the very heart of German politics. The flames lit the night sky, and Hitler seized the moment with ruthless calculation. Blaming communists for the destruction, he persuaded President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree. With a single stroke of the pen, civil liberties were suspended, freedom of speech crushed, and opponents stripped of protection. Thousands were arrested without trial. The fragile democracy of Weimar Germany collapsed in smoke and fear. From this point forward, power consolidated rapidly. In March 1933, the Enabling Act was passed, granting Hitler the authority to rule without parliament. What remained of democracy was dissolved. Political parties were outlawed. Trade unions dismantled. Opposition silenced. By the summer, Germany was no longer a republic. It was a dictatorship with Adolf Hitler at its helm. But political power was only one part of the transformation. The Nazi regime built its identity on propaganda and terror. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, orchestrated a campaign that saturated every corner of life. Newspapers, films, posters, and radio broadcasts carried a single narrative: Hitler as savior, Germany as victim, and Jews as the eternal enemy. Lies became truth, and truth was silenced. Behind the spectacle stood force. The SS and Gestapo operated in shadows, spreading fear through surveillance, imprisonment, and violence. Concentration camps were established not yet as factories of death, but as instruments of intimidation, places to break political opponents and instill terror in all who might resist. Then came the laws that stripped away humanity piece by piece. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws defined Jews not by faith, but by blood. Citizens became subjects. Rights were erased. Intermarriage between Jews and Germans was outlawed. Jewish businesses and professions were attacked. A people who had lived among Germans for centuries were now branded as outsiders in their own homeland. Propaganda justified the cruelty, convincing many that these laws were protection rather than persecution. Silence spread across society. Those who might have spoken out looked away, fearing the consequences. Hatred became normalized, and exclusion was written into law. The persecution did not remain confined to paper. On November 9, 1938, violence erupted across Germany. Windows shattered, synagogues burned, and Jewish businesses were destroyed. This night, remembered as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, was a turning point. Nearly 100 Jews were murdered, thousands more arrested and sent to camps. It was not the beginning of Nazi hatred, but it was the moment it became unmistakable, visible to the world. Yet even as Jewish lives were shattered, Hitler's ambition stretched beyond Germany's borders. He spoke of Lebensraum, living space. A vision of expansion that demanded conquest. In 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland, defying the Treaty of Versailles. The world did nothing. In 1938, he annexed Austria in the Anschluss, greeted by cheering crowds. Later that year, after orchestrating a crisis, he seized the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, again without resistance. Each move emboldened him. Each victory strengthened the illusion that destiny was on his side. To many Germans, it seemed as though Hitler had delivered what he promised: pride restored, jobs created, strength reclaimed. But beneath the surface, hatred was tightening its grip, and the machinery of oppression was moving relentlessly forward. By 1939, Germany stood transformed. The promise of renewal had given way to a reality of fear and persecution. The nation was armed, its people indoctrinated, its enemies marked. And at its center stood Adolf Hitler, convinced that history itself bent to his will. The world watched uneasily, uncertain whether to confront him or to hope he would be satisfied. But Hitler was not a man of satisfaction. He was a man of ambition, driven by hatred, and ready to plunge the world into war. On the morning of September 1, 1939, thunder rolled not from the sky, but from the ground. German tanks crossed into Poland. Dive bombers screamed overhead. Soldiers marched with ruthless precision. Within weeks, the Polish state was crushed under the weight of Nazi aggression. The spark of war had been struck, and the world would burn. Britain and France declared war, yet their response came too late to save Poland. Hitler's strategy of blitzkrieg, lightning war, unleashed a force unlike anything Europe had seen. Speed, surprise, and overwhelming power left enemies disoriented and broken. In the spring of 1940, Denmark fell in a single day, Norway within weeks. Soon after, German troops swept through Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. By June, France itself collapsed. The German army, humiliated 2 decades earlier, now marched triumphantly through Paris. For many Germans, it seemed that history had been reversed. The shame of Versailles was forgotten in the glow of conquest. Hitler appeared unstoppable, the man who had risen from obscurity now commanding the mightiest military machine in Europe. Crowds cheered him as a hero, convinced that he had restored their nation to greatness. Yet not every battle brought triumph. Across the Channel, Britain stood defiant. In the summer of 1940, German planes filled the skies, raining bombs upon London and cities across the island. But the British spirit did not break. The Royal Air Force fought back with resilience, and the Blitz failed to deliver victory. For the first time, Hitler had met resistance that his armies could not crush. Still, his ambitions pressed further. He had made a pact with Joseph Stalin, carving Poland in two and securing his eastern flank. But alliances meant little to Hitler when weighed against his vision of empire. In June 1941, he betrayed the pact and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. Millions of German soldiers stormed into the Soviet Union, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The first months were a storm of victories. Soviet armies crumbled, cities fell, and vast territories were seized. Hitler believed destiny itself had opened the gates of conquest. He spoke of Lebensraum, of German colonization, of a 1,000-year Reich spreading eastward. In his mind, this was not merely war. It was the fulfillment of his vision. But the war in the East carried a darker dimension. Behind the front lines, special units known as Einsatzgruppen followed the army. Their orders were not to fight soldiers, but to eliminate entire populations. Jews, communists, and civilians were rounded up and executed by the tens of thousands. Pits were dug, gunfire echoed, and villages vanished. What had begun as persecution now escalated into mass murder. By the end of 1941, Hitler's empire stretched further than any German leader had ever dreamed. From the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow, from Norway's fjords to the deserts of North Africa, Nazi banners flew. Yet victory was not secure. Winter closed in on the Eastern Front, halting the advance. Britain still resisted, and across the Atlantic, the United States prepared to enter the war. In those years of triumph, Hitler believed himself invincible. But beneath the illusion of domination lay the seeds of overreach. The man who had promised glory to his nation was leading it deeper into a war that would one day consume it. The tide of war began to turn in the East. What Hitler had imagined as a swift campaign to crush the Soviet Union became a brutal struggle of endurance. As winter closed its grip in late 1941, German soldiers froze in trenches, ill-prepared for the cold. Supplies dwindled, morale collapsed, and the Red Army began to resist with unrelenting fury. Hitler refused to retreat. He demanded his armies stand fast, regardless of the cost. In 1942, his obsession fixed on a single city, Stalingrad. To Hitler, it was not only a strategic target but a symbol. Victory there would break Soviet resolve, defeat there would shatter his illusion of invincibility. For months, German and Soviet forces clashed in a nightmare of rubble and blood. Street by street, house by house, men fought with knives, grenades, and bare hands. When the Soviet encirclement came, entire German armies were trapped. Starved, exhausted, and abandoned, they surrendered in the winter of 1943. Stalingrad was not just a defeat. It was the breaking point. From that moment, the German advance became a retreat. In North Africa, Hitler's forces were driven back. In Italy, Allied troops landed, forcing Mussolini from power. In the skies, bombers rained destruction on German cities, reducing once proud skylines to ashes. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, all scarred by firestorms. The war that Hitler had promised would bring glory now brought ruin to his own people. Even as the walls closed in, his hatred only deepened. The machinery of the Holocaust accelerated. In January 1942, at the Wannsee Conference, Nazi officials formalized the plan known as the Final Solution. Jews across Europe were rounded up, packed into trains, and transported to death camps designed for extermination. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, names that would forever be etched in horror. Gas chambers replaced firing squads. Industrialized murder became policy. By 1944, millions had been killed. Entire communities vanished. Inside the Reich, fear was absolute. The Gestapo hunted dissent, and even whispers of resistance could mean death. Yet not all were silent. In July 1944, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb hidden in a conference room. The explosion killed 4 men, but Hitler survived with only minor injuries. In his eyes, survival was proof of destiny. In reality, it was paranoia that deepened his grip. Thousands were executed in the aftermath, a purge that silenced opposition but revealed his growing isolation. By now, Hitler no longer trusted his generals. He issued commands disconnected from reality, demanding offensives that could not succeed, insisting on defenses that cost countless lives. He retreated further into his headquarters, living in a world where loyalty mattered more than truth, and where his own will stood above all reason. The man who once mesmerized crowds now presided over a crumbling empire. His armies bled on two fronts. His cities burned under Allied bombs. His allies faltered, and his people starved. Yet he clung to power with the same ferocity he had once used to seize it. The descent had begun, and with it, the unraveling of a man who could no longer distinguish between destiny and delusion. By the dawn of 1945, the Reich that Adolf Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years was collapsing in less than 12. Allied armies advanced from the west. The Red Army stormed from the east. German cities lay in ruins, their people starving, their streets filled with rubble and despair. What had begun as a vision of renewal ended in devastation. In January, Soviet forces pushed into East Prussia. By April, they had reached the gates of Berlin. The city was already a graveyard of bombed buildings and broken spirits. Inside an underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler remained, a shadow of the man who once commanded nations. He raged at his generals, demanded impossible defenses, and issued orders that condemned more lives to needless death. Reality no longer touched him. As Soviet shells rained down on the capital, Hitler clung to denial. He believed new armies would rise, that betrayal within his ranks explained the defeats, that fate would still deliver him victory. But outside his bunker, the truth was undeniable. Entire divisions were gone. Children were handed rifles and told to fight. The empire he had built was ashes. On April 29, news arrived from Italy. Benito Mussolini, once his ally and model, had been executed by partisans. His body and that of his mistress were desecrated, hung upside down in the streets for all to see. For Hitler, the image was terrifying. It was a glimpse of his own fate should he fall into enemy hands. He resolved that it would not happen. The next day, April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his life in the bunker, alongside his new wife, Eva Braun. Their bodies were burned in the courtyard above, as Soviet troops closed in. The man who had brought war to the world, who had promised an empire of glory, left behind only ruins and death. But the tragedy did not end with him. Joseph Goebbels, his minister of propaganda, poisoned his 6 young children before taking his own life with his wife. Heinrich Himmler, architect of the SS and the camps, was captured while trying to flee. Other Nazi leaders scattered, hunted across Europe, but they could not escape the reckoning. In May, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. But the full scope of Hitler's crimes was only beginning to be revealed. Allied troops liberated concentration camps, uncovering horrors that defied imagination. Piles of bodies, gas chambers, mass graves. Survivors barely alive, their eyes hollow from suffering. The world looked upon the evidence of the Holocaust and understood, at last, the depth of the darkness he had unleashed. At Nuremberg, the architects of the regime were brought to trial. Their crimes, crimes against humanity, were laid bare before the world. Some were executed, others imprisoned, but no punishment could erase what had been done. Hitler's legacy was not the empire he dreamed of, but the devastation he left behind. Entire cities destroyed. Millions dead. 6 million Jews exterminated in the Holocaust. A continent scarred by fire and war. His vision of dominance ended not in glory, but in ruin. In the end, Adolf Hitler did not merely betray the world. He betrayed his own people, dragging them into destruction and leaving them with nothing but shame. His rise had been built on lies, his reign sustained by fear, his fall marked by cowardice. The scars of his rule would never fully heal. And so history remembers him not as the savior he promised to be, but as the architect of one of humanity's darkest chapters. Adolf Hitler promised greatness. He promised renewal, pride, and destiny. What he delivered was war, ruin, and genocide. His vision consumed millions of lives, shattered families, and left entire nations scarred. The empire he claimed would endure for 1,000 years collapsed in less than 12, leaving behind only rubble and grief. The story of Hitler is not only the story of one man. It is the story of how despair can be manipulated, how lies can become truth when repeated with conviction, how a nation humiliated and desperate can surrender its soul to hatred. It is a story that warns us that tyranny does not rise in strength alone, but in silence, in the silence of those who look away, of those who choose not to resist. The Holocaust revealed the capacity of humanity for cruelty on an industrial scale. 6 million Jews, alongside millions of others, were exterminated because of an ideology built on hate. Their voices were silenced, their lives erased. Yet their memory demands that the world never forget, never deny, and never allow such darkness to rise again. Hitler died in a bunker, not on a battlefield. He died not as a conqueror, but as a coward, abandoning his people to the devastation he had created. In the end, even the nation he claimed to love was left in ruins, betrayed by his delusion and sacrificed to his pride. History remembers him not as the savior he pretended to be, but as the embodiment of destruction. And his story, however dark, remains a warning. That when hatred is given power, when lies are allowed to fester, when fear is used as a weapon, the cost is measured not in victories, but in ashes. The world that emerged from his war carries scars that will never fade. Yet it also carries a responsibility. A responsibility to remember, to resist, and to guard against the return of voices that promise glory at the price of humanity.
For in the echoes of the past lies the lesson of the present, that tyranny rises only when we allow it, and that history's darkest chapters must never be repeated. The story of Adolf Hitler is not just history. It is a warning. It shows how fear can be twisted, how lies can be disguised as truth, and how ordinary people can be led into extraordinary darkness. His rise was not inevitable. It was allowed. His power did not begin in the flames of war, but in the silence of those who refused to speak until it was too late. As we remember the millions who suffered and died, we carry a responsibility to recognize the signs, to resist the voices of hatred, and to protect the fragile bonds of humanity. The past cannot be undone, but the future is still ours to shape. And the greatest defense against another tyrant is memory, to remember, to resist, and to never again allow history's darkest shadows to fall upon us.